Indiana's wild landscape is made possible in part by Sierra Club, Hoosier Chapter, John Hougham of Nashville, Indiana, and by WTIU members. Thank you.
The landscape of Indiana can be surprising. Nearly every acre of the state has been altered in one way or another over the past 200 years. But tucked away in hidden corners or sprawling across thousands of acres, Indiana still has the essence of a wild past. "20,000 years ago, Indiana was buried under an ice age. Most of the state was covered by glaciers a mile high, which advanced and retreated multiple times over 3 million years. The landscape during these periods included tundra and spruce forests, vanishing and then reappearing with each new glacial cycle. As the glaciers moved and flowed across the landscape, they flattened some areas and filled in others. Temporary rivers roared with the meltwater from billions of tons of ice. Each time the ice sheets melted, water carved new features across the state. After the glaciers disappeared for the final time 10,000 years ago, the place that would be called Indiana was at last revealed. Long after the end of the ice ages, the winter landscape of Indiana is still a harsh one. Little grows at this time of year, and animals that do not hibernate poke through leaves and snow, looking for the bounty of last year. Above them, turkey vultures scan the landscape for carcasses and roadkill. Rivers and waterfalls grow thick with ice that in severe winters may slow or obstruct flowing water. Nearly all plants are dormant, in part to protect against the harsh winter conditions. But it is because the plants of Indiana become seasonally dormant that one of the world's most spectacular natural displays occurs as spring arrives. A 100 species and more of spring plants send up leaves and flowers in the brief interlude of sun and warmth before the trees above leaf out and shade the ground below. Among the first to bloom is bloodroot, which flowers for only a few days, while May apples flowers later and longer. Trout lilies are found in mid-spring and may carpet the ground in dense beds. In marshes and wetlands, skunk cabbage and marsh marigold can be seen along the margins of streams. In the deep, rich woodlands, the trilliums are among the most awaited of the spring ephemeral flowers. Forests were once the most common landscape in Indiana. Trees covered more than 90% of the state. Most of the original forests were cut down for fuel and building materials or burned off to create farmland in the 19th century. As a result, in the flatter northern half of the state, there aren't many woodlands larger than a few hundred acres. But in west central and southern Indiana, where the terrain is more rugged, extensive forests have returned. Thousands of acres, including a federally designated wilderness, give a glimpse of the endless forests that once were. Non-native species, such as starlings, are now a common sight. But a diversity of native birds signal a healthier landscape. Pileated woodpeckers are one of the most charismatic inhabitants of Indiana. But in these woodlands, dozens of smaller birds are also found. Red-eyed vireos are a common nesting bird, as is the more secretive ovenbird that nests on the ground. The cerulean warbler is a rare sight. Migrating from Latin America, their wintering grounds and their populations have slowly dwindled in recent years. Indiana's ancient forests are almost entirely gone. But a small number of old-growth woodlands still exist. They are scattered around the state. And while generally only a few dozen to a few hundred acres in size, they still contain large trees and a rich diversity of life. One of the more surprising parts of this landscape may be the orchids. There are 40 species native to the state, more than Hawaii. And many are found in rich woodlands and wetlands. The lady slippers are the best known. The showy, the yellow, the white, and the pink. Other orchids are better known by their distinctive leaves. Perhaps the most spectacular are the orange-fringed orchids. A wetland species, they may be found in Indiana's most famous landscape, one that is still surprisingly wild. The Indiana Dunes stretch 50 miles and are the result of wind and waves coming off of Lake Michigan. The sand dunes are active and over time flow into the nearby forests, often burying trees. This landscape includes some of the most diverse plant populations in America, a result of the complicated geography. Forested ridges stand above marshy depressions, which in turn may be only a few feet from a native prickly pear cactus growing on a sandy rise. This combination of forest and marsh is a critical component in the migratory path of many birds. As they travel north, these migrants often make strategic stops on the southern shores of the Great Lakes as they refuel or search out a place to nest. The warblers are especially numerous. There may be dozens present during the migratory peaks. They travel under a variety of names: the Blackburnian, the magnolia, the prothonotary, the chestnut-sided, and the black-throated blue. The gorges and valleys of Pine Hills and Shade State Park, as well as the nearby region, are considered to be some of the finest examples of incised meanders and canyons carved by glacial meltwaters in the eastern U.S. where glaciers never reached, Indiana is often a much more rugged landscape than in the northern parts of the state. The deep and shaded canyons of Fern Cliff are a cool refuge for the dozens of species of ferns, bryophytes, and mosses that cover seemingly every surface. Jug Rock is an example of a ridgeline that has eroded away, except for one last remnant of harder stone, which stands 50 feet tall. Further south, hidden valleys bubble with natural springs and overhanging waterfalls. One of the only natural arches in the state is also found in this region. But it is beneath southern Indiana that another, ever more surprising landscape can be found. "400 million years ago, this area was beneath a tropical sea. Over tens of millions of years, the shells and remains of sea creatures were deposited on the ocean floor, building up deep layers. These layers eventually formed the limestone deposits for which Indiana is renowned. Over time, the limestone has eroded away, forming sinkholes on the surface and vast tunnels, caverns, and waterways underground. Spring Mill State Park has some of the best examples in Indiana of waterways that emerge from large cave entrances and then quickly disappear again underground. Water in this region quickly drains and flows down into darkness. Far from sunlight, some creatures have become adapted to these underground rivers and pools and have lost their coloration and their sight. Blind crayfish scavenge what they can from the debris that washes down from the surface. Blind cavefish are found in slower water and deeper pools. Despite a small size of 3 inches or less, they are likely the top predator in these underground waterways, feeding primarily on tiny crustaceans and crayfish. And always there is water, flowing, dripping, carving, pooling over 1 million years. Squire Boone Caverns has some of the most accessible and spectacular flowing underground water in the state. It rushes over large rimstone dams and waterfalls. It flows through mineralized straws and tubes. Formations fall away from cave ceilings like curtains in rooms 100 feet across and more. The landscape of nearby Wyandotte Cave is much drier. Water drips here rather than flows. In the past, water was more common, and rooms larger than football fields have formed, with pillars and columns that rise up in the center. In Wyandotte, strange and intricate tubes bend in all directions, while in other rooms, mineral deposits glitter like diamonds. Most of the caves of Indiana are hidden and difficult to access. Some of the more remote underground caverns have passageways that stretch for miles and have yet to be seen by people. In all caves, however, there is also life closer to the surface. Bats commonly use caves to hibernate during winters. Wyandotte is one of the most important bat hibernacula in the state. The air temperature not far from the surface remains in the low 50s year-round. In the twilight zone near the surface, cave crickets are a common sight. These are relatively large insects, up to 1 inch long, and are scavengers. They are also prey for the cave salamander. Found on the surface as well, these salamanders are not blind, but are a common cave inhabitant in southern Indiana. Bat populations in the United States have been devastated in recent years by a fungal disease known as white nose syndrome. Accidentally introduced into caves by human visitors, millions of bats have died in many areas. It is hoped that bats resistant to white nose will eventually be able to rebuild healthy populations. Today, however, it is unclear how many will survive. Prairies are perhaps the hardest hit of Indiana's original landscape. Only a handful of virgin prairies survive, none larger than a few acres. Most are located within 19th century cemeteries that predate the conversion of prairies to farmland. Royal catchfly is a plant that likely would be gone from the state's landscape were it not for these cemetery prairies. Displaying an intense red, a color particularly attractive to many butterflies. Birds that nest low or on the ground are a common sight in the prairie, such as the meadowlark. German Methodist Prairie Cemetery features perhaps the most diverse single acre of plant species in the state, with over 200 recorded. surrounded by a fence to protect it from trampling, is perhaps the state's most spectacular display of shooting stars. These flowers are often seen on rocky outcroppings in the south, but here, thousands wave amongst the grasses and forbs. It is a tiny glimpse of what the 2-million-acre Indiana prairie might have looked like 200 years ago. Prairie dock and compass plants push their blossoms above the grass stalks that dominate this landscape. Prairies blaze with color in July, and perhaps the most spectacular displays can be seen in the Kankakee region of northwest Indiana, as fields of blazing star wave in the prairie breezes. Restoration efforts are underway at Kankakee Sands in Indiana's prairie region. It is anticipated that a large landscape of tall grasses and wildflowers will return to the state in the coming years. Lakes and marshes take center stage in the northern parts of the state. Olin Lake is Indiana's largest undeveloped body of water with a continuous shoreline of forest and wetlands. Waterfowl are a common sight here. And kingfishers hunt from overhanging branches. These deep waters are as clear as any to be found in the state. Bubbles on the lake bottom signal that algae and other plants are producing oxygen. Fist-sized mussels can also be found on the lake bottom, some of which may be over 100 years old. The margins of healthy lakes are thick with aquatic vegetation that serve as nurseries and cover for immature fish. In the summer months, an unexpected creature may be found in the lakes of Indiana. Freshwater jellyfish, an inch across, busily pulse and tumble through the water. Though not necessarily common, they may be found year after year in the same lake. The Grand Marsh of the Kankakee was once one of the largest wetlands in America, with a river that twisted and turned for miles across northwestern Indiana. Today, it is largely a memory. Its riverbanks were straightened and forced into artificial channels. As a result, the wetlands it once filled have dried out. Although in some ways the waters do try to find ways to return. In the healthier rivers and streams of Indiana, such as the Tippecanoe, a glimpse into a more bountiful past is possible. In such waterways, dozens of mussel species can be found in the same stretch of water. Today, because of development and agricultural runoff, their numbers are tiny. Mussels survive by filtering the water for food. They move by pulling themselves through the sand and silt with an extending muscular foot. But in places like Wildcat Creek, diverse groups can still be seen. Many other types of shellfish, crustaceans, and fish teem across the rocks and creeks in the still healthy systems, such as the Blue River in the southern part of the state. Another indicator of healthy waterways is the giant hellbender salamander. Once more numerous, but now largely gone from the state. The few remaining adults no longer seem to reproduce. However, efforts have been made in recent years to release juveniles and keep the hellbender as an Indiana native. In overlooked and unappreciated ponds and small bodies of water, another natural spectacle is fleeting and often unnoticed. They often will appear on only a handful of warm, rainy nights in late winter or early spring. In pools of water that may dry out over the summer, amphibians such as spring peepers, wood frogs, and the spotted salamander frantically search for a mate. Along the bottomlands that mark the joining of the Wabash and Ohio rivers, perhaps the most unexpected landscape of all can be found. In places like Hovey Lake and Twin Swamps, cypress sloughs thrive in near-permanent standing waters. Reminiscent of the bayous of Louisiana, these unique forests were once more widespread in Indiana. Cypress trees are a deciduous conifer that drop needles and foliage over the winter. Their trunks can swell far larger than most trees, and some of the largest in the state may be more than 7 feet thick. In these remaining locations, hidden away underwater, are creatures more common in the southern swamps of the U.S., such as the water puppy, and the snake-like siren, both a type of salamander. Many birds that seem more suited to life on an ocean coastline are also natives of Indiana. Double-crested cormorants can be found nesting and fishing in ice-free waters throughout North America. In Indiana, this often includes the lower Wabash River, especially cooling ponds near power plants. Another oceanic bird that has made a life for itself on the inland waterways of Indiana is the least interior tern. Terns nest on gravel bars along larger rivers. This type of habitat has dwindled as rivers are dammed and floodplains farmed. They too may nest near the ponds of power plants, which is not an ideal location. In recent years, artificial islands have been built to provide more ideal and protected habitat for these federally endangered birds. By early November, the fall foliage of Indiana has reached peak colors. Gold and crimson and lemon yellows are splashed across the landscape. And it is in these forests, particularly in southern Indiana, that perhaps the greatest reminders of Indiana's wild past have begun to reappear. Black bears were hunted into extinction in the state by the end of the 19th century. In recent years, however, confirmed sightings have been reported in both the northern and southern edges of Indiana. These were young males, most likely searching out new territory. And while they did not stay in Indiana, it is not unexpected that more might follow. Mountain lions have also been confirmed in the state in recent years, as their populations in states to the west continue to expand. These sightings are often controversial, and while it does not appear that bears or mountain lions are presently reproducing in the state, it does seem reasonable to believe that both have begun to reintroduce themselves into a landscape they have been absent from for 150 years. Another sign that wildlife is expanding and succeeding in the state can be seen every fall at Jasper-Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area. The return of tens of thousands of sandhill cranes to the wetlands of northern Indiana is one of the most spectacular natural events to be seen in the Midwest. The cranes stop over on their migratory journey south from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. They feed in the marshes and on leftover grain in the fields, and roost overnight in the wetlands. In between, they congregate and socialize by the thousands in the fields that are maintained for their yearly visits. Indiana has a surprisingly diverse landscape. It includes glacially dug lakes, hidden waterfalls, dense forests, deep canyons, and unknown caves. All of these habitats support a dizzying array of life, from the tiniest of creatures to massive trees that stretch 150 feet into the sky. This is a place, this is a state that is still wild.
For a DVD or Blu-ray disc of this program or other WTIU-produced programs, go online at www.shopwtiu.org.
Indiana's wild landscape is made possible in part by Sierra Club, Hoosier Chapter, John Hougham of Nashville, Indiana, and by WTIU members. Thank you.